Hello makers! Today we're going to learn about creating a flexible sewable subcomponent using Lumin's Workshop ultralight foam clay, generously provided by Arda Wigs. And behind me, as you can see, my current project is Mysterio from Spider-Man Far From Home. He has a lot of detail in his cloak, and I also have these tiny little light fixtures that I have to install into the fabric. And I'm trying to find a way to create a sewable base for these little light lenses that I have laser cut. So what I did was I used other acrylic pieces for my light lens to sit on, and I essentially casted it with Smooth-On's 1-to-1 part Umu, which is really easy to do. So once my mold is complete, we're going to work together to create a sewable subcomponent. Let's get started. So step one, I have a handful of my foam clay that I've actually been kneading and working out for about 5 minutes, to be honest, because I want to get some of that excess moisture out of it. It'll help with air bubbles or excess moisture that might be left in the foam clay while it's in the tub. So once it feels like it's been worked enough and it's not as gummy, I'm gonna just press it directly into my mold. So here's the base for the light lens that I mentioned earlier. So I'm gonna press it right into this mold. Just very evenly, get it right into those cracks. There's a lot of really good detail in there. Spread it around. It's honestly better to just take a large handful and just kind of work it into the mold as opposed to lots of little pieces, because that'll cause unneeded air bubbles. So I pretty much think I've worked it well enough into my shape. The next step is to take a micro mesh. This is just a really fine mesh that you can purchase at Joann's, Michael's, even I think I got this one at Walmart. So I'm gonna actually just overlay it right onto the clay that I just pressed into my mold. So what we're doing with the mesh is we are pressing it into the mold because foam, if we want to make it sewable, we don't want it to rip. It naturally, without any sort of support structure like the mesh inside of it, it's just going to literally rip apart. The mesh provides a little bit of extra structure inside of it, because when we do the layers, the porousness of the mesh will create just a little bit extra structure that the foam can essentially press into, adhere to, and once it's dry, it's actually pretty darn stable. This technique often is used with silicone molding when creating a lot of perhaps those hard goods for superhero costumes, etc. But this is perhaps an easier option for those not comfortable with silicone pouring and curing, etc., etc. So I've got my mesh in there, and now I'm going to start to take small pieces of the lightweight foam and just literally sandwich that mesh in there. Make sure that that mesh is pressed and the foam is essentially getting into the holes of the mesh, that porousness, because that's really most important. You want it to press into there so that the layers of the foam don't pull apart later on once dry. All right, so now after the proper cure time, our mold is ready to be pulled. So let's see what it looks like. Awesome. So foam clay picks up details super nicely. And so I also have an example of the finished subcomponent. Once the excess is trimmed away, super easy. The mesh is still embedded inside, but you can barely see it. Awesome. And super flexible. That's what I want. So what I'm going to do next is sew this, show you how to sew it directly into fabric, and it'll be the perfect base, as you can see, for my light. That'll be really cool. Alright, so it looks like I've successfully sewn the foam clay onto my fabric. Now I had to record this segment of the video 2 days later because the foam clay takes 48 hours to cure, and if it's not properly cured it won't sew well. It'll the foot of the sewing machine will smash it, it'll mush it, it'll be very kind of like trying to sew mud in a sense, or clay. So I had to make sure that it was properly cured. And now it sews really nicely right onto my fabric with a zipper foot. I used a zipper foot on my machine so I can get really nice and close to the edges that I created, those little grooves in the foam clay component. And it now bends really nicely with my fabric. And if I need to cover up any unsightly seam lines, I can always go back in with a little extra foam clay and smooth that out, cover that up, because foam clay is really good about adhering to itself. Alright, so I had a couple questions when using the foam clay as a sewable component. Is the clay brittle? Like when bending, is it brittle after dried? I haven't found that at all with Lumin's foam clay so far. It's been a really nice high quality foam clay, really nice properties. And then my second question was, how does foam clay do with moisture after it's dry? And that, unfortunately, you do have to take into account when sewing your foam clay onto your garment, not to put it in a high sweat area of your garment, because I did a test with foam clay. This was the same mold, the same cure, and after I immersed this in water with like a little bit of vinegar just to simulate like maybe the chemical reaction that salty sweat would have on foam clay, and unfortunately it did dissolve quite a bit, and that, I mean, that was literally 30 minutes submerged, so maybe it wouldn't be so bad if it was just a few minutes, but I would definitely recommend, you know, making sure you're putting the foam clay maybe not in a super high sweat area, or just making sure that you just have an extra layer of fabric as a good sweat guard or barrier in your garment to protect your foam clay. So I hope that everyone enjoyed this tutorial. I'm really excited to work more with the foam clay, especially on Mysterio behind me. I now have a nice little base for the light that I'm going to use later on, and then I'll paint it, and definitely do a second tutorial about painting and sealing your foam clay for your garment. But until then, I hope you enjoyed, and a big shout out to Arda Wigs for providing the Lumin's foam clay for this project, as well as Takmade on Etsy, Takmade, for doing the custom laser cutting for this project. So thank you all. I hope you enjoy further tutorials.